If you hate hypocrisy, why does it live in you? This paradox reveals a universal truth. Every human being detests hypocrisy in others, yet quietly sustains it within themselves. We condemn duplicity, but practice it subtly through small compromises, convenient beliefs, or self-justifying narratives. Hypocrisy, in its deepest sense, is not simply deceit toward others. It is the fracture between what one believes and what one lives. Modern psychology calls this cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort arising when actions contradict self-image. For Al-Ghazali, the 11th century philosopher and moral psychologist, hypocrisy was not an occasional moral slip, but a persistent psychological disease. It manifests whenever thought, emotion, and action fall out of alignment. In his view, the true danger of hypocrisy lies not in fooling others, but in becoming blind to one's own inconsistency, a blindness that corrupts sincerity at its root in modern life. Hypocrisy has become almost structural. The average person now maintains multiple identities: professional, social, digital, and private, each optimized for a different audience. Neuroscience confirms that the brain's self-representation networks activate differently depending on context. In other words, we literally become different selves in different situations. This adaptive multiplicity can be useful. It allows social flexibility. But when taken too far, it becomes adaptive inconsistency, a condition where survival replaces sincerity. We begin to tailor truth, not seek it. Social media intensifies this division. Platforms reward presentation over authenticity, training the brain's reward system to prioritize appearance over integrity. The dopamine feedback loop ensures that we continue projecting curated versions of ourselves that win approval, but erode coherence. Psychologically, hypocrisy thrives on confirmation bias and motivated reasoning, mental mechanisms that protect self-image at the cost of truth. We selectively interpret evidence that flatters us and dismiss what challenges our identity. Over time, this generates a subtle exhaustion, anxiety, moral confusion, and spiritual fatigue, symptoms of a divided consciousness. Trying to maintain internal contradiction, to understand the mechanics of hypocrisy, Al-Ghazali approached the problem with both philosophical precision and psychological realism. Born in 1058 CE, he mastered theology, logic, and metaphysics, yet ultimately turned his focus to the science of the soul. He viewed the human being as a system of three competing faculties: reason, desire, and spirit. Each exerts influence on behavior, and moral balance arises only when reason governs desire under the light of spiritual insight. Hypocrisy, in this model, is a malfunction when intellect serves desire instead of guiding it. Al-Ghazali described this as epistemic blindness, the mind's inability to recognize its own deception. The hypocrite, he said, is not merely dishonest with others, but fundamentally misaligned with reality. In The Revival of Religious Sciences, he warned scholars that knowledge without sincerity becomes a form of self-worship, a subtle idolatry of intellect. His cure was a process of purification, the deliberate alignment of thought, intention, and behavior until self-deception dissolves. Al-Ghazali's first warning concerns the intellect. He called it the hypocrisy of knowledge, when the mind knows what the character refuses to live. Modern psychology confirms this gap. Research on cognitive behavioral inconsistency shows that intellectual awareness alone rarely transforms behavior. The brain can store moral or philosophical knowledge in regions, unrelated to habit formation, meaning one can understand virtue, yet act otherwise. We see this everywhere. Individuals who study mindfulness, yet remain chronically distracted, or moral theorists who fail to embody their ethics. This disjunction arises because information remains on the surface, processed by the rational cortex, but never integrated into emotional and behavioral networks. Neuroscientifically, knowledge that does not reach the insular and anterior cingulate cortex, areas responsible for emotional awareness and behavioral regulation, remains inert. It stays as concept, not conviction. Al-Ghazali summarized this elegantly: knowledge becomes a veil when it fails to penetrate the heart. True learning, therefore, is not accumulation, but assimilation, the conversion of idea into being. Knowledge that is not lived becomes hypocrisy in thought. It decorates the intellect while concealing moral emptiness. The second layer of hypocrisy, according to Al-Ghazali, lies in the emotional life. Emotions can mimic virtue even when they arise from ego. One may display compassion, guilt, or humility, yet unconsciously seek validation through these displays. He called this Riya ostentation, the desire to appear righteous. It is a form of emotional mimicry where the feeling of sincerity replaces its reality. Modern affective science calls this emotional self-deception, when one's emotional expressions serve to protect self-image rather than express authentic states. Public virtue signaling, social outrage, or performative guilt are modern illustrations. In such cases, emotion functions not as moral insight but as moral theater. Neuroscience provides an explanation. The dopaminergic reward system reinforces socially approved emotional expressions. The brain literally rewards us for appearing moral, regardless of inner congruence. Thus, emotional hypocrisy is biologically reinforced. Al-Ghazali's insight was clinical. Sentiment is not sincerity. Emotional authenticity arises only when the heart's feeling, the intellect's principle, and the action's consequence form a coherent triad. To feel good without being good is to live in a state of subtle contradiction. The third and most pervasive form of hypocrisy lies in intention. Al-Ghazali stated, "The root of hypocrisy lies in the corruption of intention. A person may act righteously, give charity, teach, pray, or serve, but if the hidden motive is status, approval, or identity maintenance, the act becomes hollow." Modern psychology captures this through implicit motivation theory. Most actions are driven by subconscious motives of control, belonging, or recognition, often misaligned with conscious values. Similarly, self-serving bias allows individuals to attribute their virtues to internal goodness and their failures to circumstance, preserving a flattering self-image. Al-Ghazali compared this to a chronic disease, one that disguises itself as health. The ego thrives on subtle self-reference, constantly asking, "How do I appear?" Neuroscientific research shows that this inner commentary originates in the default mode network, the brain's circuit of self-referential thought. Purifying intention, therefore, means quieting this network, acting without narrative, without internal commentary. For Al-Ghazali, sincerity begins when the act is performed not for identity, but for truth itself. Finally, Al-Ghazali confronted the most sacred form of hypocrisy, that of worship. He observed that people often worship habitually rather than consciously. They perform rituals perfectly, but without inner presence. He called this imitation without comprehension. The mind repeats sacred forms while the heart remains absent. From a psychological perspective, this aligns with automaticity. the process by which repeated actions become unconscious routines. In neuroscience, habituation diminishes the brain's emotional response to familiar stimuli. As a result, spiritual practices lose vitality when reduced to mechanical repetition. Al-Ghazali summarized the problem with striking simplicity. The tongue may remember while the heart forgets. His solution was self-observation, the deliberate reintroduction of consciousness into habitual acts. Modern mindfulness research mirrors this idea. Sustained meta-awareness reactivates prefrontal control and emotional resonance, restoring depth to automatic behavior. In this light, hypocrisy in worship is not false belief but absent attention. The act itself is not impure. It is the performer's unawareness that empties it of meaning at this point. A deeper paradox arises. If one strives to purify the self, does not that very effort reinforce the ego? Al-Ghazali acknowledged this dilemma with profound subtlety. Even the pursuit of sincerity can become a new disguise for pride, the ego's final camouflage. The self that seeks to eliminate hypocrisy may secretly wish to be seen as sincere. Modern metacognitive theory identifies a similar problem, the observer paradox. The self that watches itself remains part of the same psychological system. Total objectivity is impossible because the observer is never separate from what is observed. Therefore, Al-Ghazali proposed that the goal is not egoic perfection, but egoic transparency. Sincerity is not achieved by eliminating contradiction, but by becoming fully aware of it. When contradiction is seen clearly, it loses its power to deceive. In neuroscientific terms, this state resembles integrative self-awareness. When the brain's self-referential regions quiet, an internal experience becomes unified and coherent. The seeker no longer suppresses hypocrisy. They see through it. Translating these insights into modern practice requires disciplined self-regulation rather than moral guilt. Step 1. Cognitive honesty. Develop the habit of daily self-inquiry. What contradiction am I maintaining today? Studies on self-awareness training show measurable improvements in moral reasoning and decision integrity when individuals regularly reflect on inconsistencies between values and behavior. Step 2. Intentional alignment. Before major actions, consciously define motive. Neuroscientific evidence indicates that intent setting activates prefrontal executive control, helping align behavior with long-term principles rather than impulses. Step 3. Emotion regulation. Recognize emotional hypocrisy, such as outrage that masks superiority or guilt that conceals pride. Techniques like slow breathing, journaling, and mindfulness enhance insular activation, improving interoceptive awareness and emotional accuracy. Step 4. Behavioral congruence. Perform small acts that prioritize integrity over appearance. Behavioral psychology shows that consistent microactions of honesty reduce anxiety and cognitive dissonance, strengthening moral coherence. Step 5. Reflective silence. Engage in periods of silent observation without judgment. Functional MRI studies indicate that such practices lower default mode network activity, reducing self-referential rumination and enhancing presence. The aim, as Al-Ghazali would emphasize, is integration, aligning knowing, feeling, and doing into a unified act of consciousness. The remedy to hypocrisy is not self-condemnation, but self-coherence. Al-Ghazali's exploration of hypocrisy exposes a profound epistemological trap, blindness to one's own inconsistency. Modern psychology validates his insight. that inner division generates anxiety, while integrated consciousness produces clarity and peace. Freedom from hypocrisy, then, is not moral superiority but intellectual honesty, the willingness to see the fracture within oneself without denial. When you stop pretending coherence, real coherence begins. Al-Ghazali once said, "Sincerity is to be truthful in secret as in public." That truth is psychological as much as spiritual. To live without hypocrisy does not mean to be flawless. It means to be transparent, to let truth govern perception, intention, and action without the distortions of ego. And perhaps that is the only escape from hypocrisy, not flight, but full awareness.